Hello, welcome back to I Got Board
I got
Game.
board game.
I Got Board Game.
Board games.
I'm Ben,
I'm John.
and today we are here to do a review of a modern classic, a Spiel des Jahres winner, Game of the Year winner in 2016, and a party game,
Mm-hmm.
and that is...
Make your own secret code names.
Oh gosh, where is that from?
I don't know. It's just some random pig art that I found online.
It's like you typed it yourself.
Code names.
Codenames. So as John had mentioned when we were talking before recording this, if you guys haven't heard of Codenames
At this point in time now, shame on you.
what are you doing with your board game life? No, I'm just kidding. But yes, Codenames was a really big deal when it came out, as I said, in 2016. It did win the Game of the Year award of that year, and it is a party game, like I mentioned, specifically generally a team versus team game. And so I don't know if we really reviewed any party games actually on this channel yet, but this is, I guess this would be one of the exceptions that I felt like we would have to review at some point because it was such a big deal, and it's a very simple game to pick up at any kind of retail store nowadays, and good for a lot of people. So before we get into any more of those pros that I might have just mentioned, I will go over briefly how the game plays, maybe even all the rules, because it's pretty straightforward. But yeah, hopefully John will also remind me if I miss any small rules. But to get into it, I will share this picture of the game set up. So yes, here, let me move this down here. Okay. So here is a picture of the components in Codenames and generally how it'll look like when it is set up and ready to play. You'll basically, with all your players, the game plays, the box says 4 to 8 players. Well, 2 to 8, but then generally you'll do 4 to 8 because you'll have 2 teams. So, and you'll need at least 2 people on both of those teams. I've actually never played the 2-player version, but so yeah, we'll go with 4 to 8 players.
Yep.
And box says 15 minutes. I forgot to mention, I think 15 minutes is a little too fast. At least
you guys are just slow at making clues.
Yeah, that's true. Takes time to make clues, and people often take time to discuss. So I would say 30 minutes is probably a better estimate. But basically the way the game will go is you'll have these cards that have words on them, single words, and basically it'll be written both right side up and upside down, so people sitting on both sides can read it. And then you'll split the players into 2 teams, and it doesn't have to be even technically. You don't have to be too strict about it. Just as long as you have 2 teams of at least 2 players, you'll have one team be the blue team, one team be the red team, and then both teams will choose one player to be the clue giver for their team for that gameplay session. And what's going to happen is you're going to shuffle these clue cards over here, these square cards. You're going to shuffle and take one randomly, and you'll have a little plastic stand to put it on, and you'll put it on the stand and only have the 2 clue givers look at that card, so no one else can see the clues. And what the clue card shows you is which of these words out in the grid that you made, this 5x5 grid of words, belong to your team, right? Whether you're on the blue team, it shows you which spaces or which words belong to your team, or if you're on the red team. And then it'll also show a black space, which is, I think, the assassin space,
Assassino.
where we'll explain that in a little bit. But basically the point of the game is it's going to go back and forth between both teams, and on a team's turn, the clue giver has to give a 1-word clue to basically help their team guess the words that belong to their team. And so, they would look at the grid on the clue card, see which words out here belong to them, and try to find a single word that can basically connect to or have a relation to multiple of those words. And then they'll give that one word clue followed by a number. So they could say, movie
or movie
2, if, say, for example, theater and pass were the words they want their teammates to guess, they could say movie 2. And then that number is saying how many words he's trying to get their teammate to guess that are out here. And so they think that the term movie relates to 2 words out here. And so then their teammates would take as much time as they want to discuss with each other, try to understand, what could the clue giver mean by saying movie? And they would have to point to or touch the actual words one at a time that they think are the correct ones belonging to their team, the ones that are being hinted at. And so they have to do it one at a time, because if they get it right, they can keep going. If they get it wrong, then they have to stop immediately. Their turn ends. But since the clue giver said movie 2, if they guessed theater first, and that's correct, they would put one of the tiles of their team's color, say red, onto that tile to show that they got it. They got one of their words. Mm-hmm. If it was the other team's word, they would put the other team's color on it, so then the other team would be ahead by
and then
1
the turn
point.
is over.
Yeah, and that would end the red team's turn. Or if it is a word that didn't belong to either team, they would put one of these tan cards on it, or beige cards, and that would also end your turn, but that would just be a point that didn't go to anyone. If it was the one assassin space, then you'd put the assassin tile and you automatically lost.
So that's Ben's clue of theater of a movie 2 is a horrible clue, because that was the assassin.
Yes, it is, technically, in this case. Sorry, I was just trying to think of an example as quickly as I could.
Bad clue giver.
But then say it's not the assassin, say it was the red teams, and they guessed theater, then they would put one of their red tiles on it, then they would get another guess. They would get to guess up to 2, as the clue giver said.
2 plus 1.
2. Yeah, and they could get +1 if they get their other clue correct. So if the red team then went on to guess pass and that was correct, they would put their red tile on it and they would get 1 more additional guess. And so that's the only way you can get an additional guess and on top of the number that the clue giver actually gave you. And so then once the team has guessed as many as they wanted, because they don't have to guess up to 2. If they're only confident about theater, then they could just guess that and say we're done. But once they have guessed as many as they can or wanted to, then it goes to the other team, and their clue giver would give their 1-word clue and a number, and it would continue to do the same thing. The other way you can give a clue is you can say, I believe you can say like a 1 word and say infinite to give your team as many guesses, but then it might not be that helpful, because the number is also supposed to help them know how many words you think your clue relates to. So if you're saying movie infinite, you're kind of just saying every word out there relates to.
Well, I mean, after you eat all that popcorn, you're going to need an ambulance to get out. You're drinking those bottles of water in the movie, so of course
they gotta force the bottles of water into you.
And then turkeys are turkeys and may show up in movies. So in Thanksgiving, you want to go to the movies with family after you eat. So turkey. Just kidding. That's
okay then.
That's how it works.
And then I think the last way you can give a clue is you can say a clue word and 0, which is a way to give your team infinite guesses, but it's basically hinting at them that none of our words out here relate to the word I'm giving. And so that's another more advanced way to give a clue. And then basically whichever team gets all of their words first wins and ends the game. And so, yeah, that's how the game of Codenames works. And so then there also is, well, there are a few other versions that have come out since this original version. The main other one we'll mention here and maybe throughout the rest of our review is Codename Pictures. Let me see if I have a picture of that. And it's literally replacing all the words with these kind of strange pictures that are amalgamations of different things. So it turns it into more visual clue giving, right? You're using the clue giver is giving a word that might relate to what's in the different pictures now versus relating or connecting to words instead. I think the only other change with Codename Pictures is that aside from turning it into more visual, it's a smaller grid. It's a 4x5 grid versus 5x5. And so that might make the game a little faster. But yeah, aside from that, that is how Codename plays. And so we'll get into sharing our thoughts on Codenames in general, and sometimes mentioning maybe pictures, since Codename Pictures is the version that I actually still have. Not to hint at anything about my rating of both games,
Or
but
is it?
it's the one that I still have. So that's why I wanted to also include it here, since it's pretty much the same game anyway. And so I've played both. I used to own the original version before getting Pictures, decided only to keep Pictures. John, you've only played the original version, right? And so we'll focus on talking about the original, but maybe mentioning Pictures at times. And so getting into the pros, John.
Yeah, as a pro or the positives of this game, it is definitely one of the best party games I think that exists out there, which is why at the beginning of this review we were saying if you haven't heard of Codenames, kind of where are you at? Where have you been hiding under the rock, wherever? It's because it really blew up in terms of popularity, right? When the game first came out, it is we especially called a party game in my opinion, in my perspective, because this is one of the board games that now exists in like your standard like any department store that has like a board game selections place of like where to buy board games, where you think of games like Taboo, Monopoly, Scrabble, right? All those basic old board games. Like those used to be like the ones you could sell at any like store that has a board game section would have those kinds of games. Codenames is now there, right? Codenames is basically kind of like the new version or like the modern hit party game version. Maybe a couple other games like Apples to Apples has also, like if you're familiar with that game, is kind of the similar vein of like lots of people being able to play this game at once. I would say the beauty of this game in Codenames is that the gameplay is very similar to a game, like thinking of a game like Taboo, right? In the sense of it's like a word game, right? You're giving a clue, or like you're kind of using words to indicate something that needs to be said or needs to be found. But the cool thing with Codenames is like the fact that you have a variation of words that are actually kind of presented to you as players, versus in a game like Taboo, you only usually have like or you have like your set of words, but then it's only like a few limited words, and you're not allowed to like you're kind of limited with what you're allowed to explain to somebody to try to get them to guess the words. But in this game, it's kind of the reverse, where you're trying to think of a single word to try to get everybody to guess all of the words associated with it based on your picture grid, right? And then it kind of in that way also encourages the party of players in the team to work together to try to figure out what those words are. So you're kind of, you have a player who's giving clues, and then it's a discussion among the other players to decide what to select and and whether you think the person is giving you a good clue or they're just bad at giving clues and you're just guessing and hoping for the best.
Yeah, I think what you mentioned about the popularity, I would point out that, I mean, this game has had so many spin-off versions because of how popular it was, which I think still all pretty much play the same, just with like different theming. I think earlier on there was Codename Harry Potter, and Codename Disney, and then Codename Marvel, and other random ones I mentioned to John before this. And then obviously there is the more direct kind of spin-off of Codename Pictures, as I had mentioned, and also a 2-player version of the game called Codenames Duet, which I heard plays pretty well, but I haven't played it myself. And then there's even like the extra large versions of Codenames and Codename Pictures and Codename Duet, which I've seen in person at like a game shop. And it's like a huge box, and all the tiles are made huge. And it's kind of more gimmicky, but it also seems kind of fitting for a party setting where if you could just set out a huge grid in front of everyone and you can all easily just like look around and walk around it to think about stuff. But yeah, it's very popular, and I think for its time, right, a few years back, it does deserve being like so big, because I think from thinking about other word games like Scrabble and Taboo, which have been around for a long time, this really did kind of change things up in an exciting way of making this kind of more kind of a thinky game where you could be more clever, where in Scrabble it's just like you just need to know words with your letters. Taboo, it's very much just speed and how quickly you can kind of get people to think about things. But in this one, this whole idea of like giving one clue to link multiple words, that pushes at least the clue giver and then even their teammates who have to try to understand their clue to really think cleverly of like, what could that word actually be referring to or linking to? And then I think even a smaller piece on top of that is what would the clue giver be thinking that word links to? And that has that kind of interesting mind game element, but in your own team of trying to understand each other, which I think makes it work really well, especially if it's, you can feel like you're getting more in sync with your own team, and then the other team has to feel like, oh no, we got to get more in sync, and how can we catch up.
Yeah. I also think the really cool thing about this game too is like it really it doesn't necessarily emphasize, as we've mentioned, I think we're mentioning a lot of word games in particular because of the word version, where games like Taboo and Scrabble, it is kind of based on an individual's kind of grasp either of English in Scrabble's case, or in Taboo of your ability to quickly like string together like sentences or words to try to get people to guess the words, right? But in this game, it's more focused on what I feel like is actually more of a game versus those which is more of a exercise in your grasp of knowledge, your grasp of grammar, or your grasp of the language in and of itself. Versus in this game, it almost encourages not using words, or not using words that are too out there or too extraneous, to use a fancy word, because you're encouraging and you're trying to get your team to guess very particular, like guessing groupings of words, which is the other cool component and part of this game, which is the fact that the shape of the way that you guess your clues and the linkage of words to words will pretty much most of the time, if not always, be different as you play this game over and over, which gives it a lot of freshness. But then it's this idea of like, you have to start linking these words that kind of don't really have maybe the closest relationship to each other, right? Like you may find yourself in a situation where you have to link a word like Ukraine to like paddles. And you have to find a way to make Ukraine and paddle come together so that your team can guess those two words, because you're trying to get as many words guessed in a turn as possible, right? And it puts you sometimes in these really funky positions in which you have to think that way. And then it's not just thinking about the ways to get your team to guess the words that you want, but you also have to look at the rest of the board too, because you might want to give certain clues, but that word might link to another word that you don't want your team to guess because it's the assassin or it's the other team's word. So it also encourages this kind of thought process where it's not just about you and your team and just getting your points maxed out simply. you have to be aware of the larger board, and kind of what Ben was alluding to a little bit as well, of this, what is the clue giver actually trying to insinuate? Because maybe they did use a word, like a particular word, but it's like, why would you use that word when this other word is out here? So like, let's say it's like you had like tree and plant, right? But then I use the word flower, right? Or something. Because then it's like, well, trees and plants, why wouldn't you say like leaves or something, right? Because then that would seem like those work together. But he said flower, so maybe he doesn't want me to think, trees or whatever, right? And that's where it encourages a lot of this kind of cleverness, as Ben was mentioning previously, which makes this, as I said, as I feel, a lot more gamey than maybe some of these other party games can sometimes feel.
Yeah, I think that part also leads into what I was mentioning. Yeah, like about the thinking of how the other person would think of it, like how the clue giver would understand the link. But I like why I want to point that out again is because I think that's also the funny moments where like, yeah, like you might be like, I know John means tree, but why would he say flower? You gotta tell us that afterward, you weirdo. Like, and then like, yeah, maybe they really do have a reason or some memory that they think they shared with you or something, like it could be whatever link that they have in their head. But because they put that clue out there and they think there's that link, it in a sense pushes the team to try to think like the clue giver, right? Pushes that kind of like synchronizing and getting in each other's mind. And so I think that that's a cool part about it. And then I would say actually that because like with your example of like flower, I think because it's done verbally, there is also that kind of idea that can lead to confusion, which can be funny.
Oh,
Of
yes.
like, wait, does he mean like baking, like cooking, like flour for dough, or like a flower outside on the ground? Like and so you might need to be careful about the words you chose, but it could be on purpose that you said a word that way too.
And actually, that's also the clever thing about, at least in the word version, and I think the picture version, as you saw some of the examples that Ben had showed previously, is there is room for interpretation. And I think they like, when they created the game, they did choose words intentionally that sometimes have multiple places or multiple ways in which like they could apply. So like the word string, for example, right? Typically, if you think of string, most people would think of like the like probably like a line, right? Like a fishing string or like a string for like sewing. But string could also mean some other things, right? It could be like a coding string, right? Like a string of code that someone types, right? So if there's like other electronic things on the board and someone uses the word like code 3, and then there's like computer or like lock, and then they're like, but I don't know what the third one is. And it's like, oh, maybe it is string, right? Because it could be a coding string. Or it's like, but then you also have to know, like, are there engineers on your team, like computer engineers who know that kind of stuff or are aware of it? Or it could totally blow over their head. And then the clue giver could be like, I can't hint because that's cheating. But
Yeah,
so the cleverness of leaving it open is really fun.
Yeah, and if that isn't clear, the clue giver can only give the word and the number, the clue and the number they're giving with it, and then they have to basically not react at all or say anything else to hint at anything to their team. Yeah. And then aside from the word version, though, I do want to point out, like with the picture version, you can see in switching the pictures, it's kind of like I mentioned, amalgamations or all these combinations of different things that you can imagine multiple words referring to. And so man, some of these are upside down, but hopefully you can see them okay. That one's kind of obvious. And so then the picture version, basically in moving away from words and doing these kind of, you could say abstract pictures, but they also are clearly things mixed with other things. I think one plus to it is that it then becomes something not dependent on language, aside from what the clue giver is giving as the their words as clues, right?
Right.
And that, I think that adds a little more value to the pictures version for me, and that's kind of, I would say, ultimately why I kept on held on to that version, because then it is something that is in a sense easier to teach, like
Mhm.
not requiring people to know all the words that are out there. And then also, I even have experience playing it with someone who, English was their second language, so they weren't necessarily familiar with a lot of words or the different meanings to words. And so this made it actually playable, where we could all just look at pictures, and then the clue giver with that teammate just had to use simpler words as clues that they would know, but could still play and try to find the right pictures that belong to their team. So it basically makes it more language independent, which I think is a plus.
Mhm.
And so aside from that, the only other pro I have is production wise. I mean, it's fairly standard production, not bad, not flimsy box, but pretty solid box, good size. There is quite a bit of space in here, so maybe it could be smaller, but I think because it's all like maybe there's some like actually, were there punch tiles? I don't. Oh yeah, there were punch
Probably.
tiles for like the different teams colored cards, I think, those tiles. But aside from that, I think the main thing about the production is it does come with an hourglass, or like a sand timer. Sorry, sand timer is the better word. That then you can optionally play with if you think the clue givers are taking too long to think of clues, which is a smart idea, I think, because yeah, that could kind of make things a little longer. And then the main thing though is the number of word cards or picture cards. Like on the picture version, and I believe it's similar to the word version, there are 140 cards, and they're double-sided,
Mhm.
so different on both sides, which then also gives you a lot more variety, right, for the same cards. But then it also allows you to set up more easily for another game, because if you look at the picture John has, like once they finish playing this round, they could literally just flip over some of those word cards, and they'll have new words, new grid, and draw a new clue card, which will then assign different words to the teams again, and you can just easily play again with a new setup. So
Mhm.
I think that's a small detail, but that does help with just being able to set up and play again and have variety.
Yep.
And so with that, we will go on to our cons for Codenames. So John.
Yeah. So one of the cons, I'll actually do a con for this one and then a con for pictures, a very small one. I'll start with the pictures one actually, and it's actually just seeing it from there because as I mentioned, I haven't played it. I think one of the very light cons about pictures in particular is, as you saw, the pictures are set up. There is a certain orientation to the
Oh,
pictures
good point. Good point.
where when, as we were talking about with Codenames regular, there's words on kind of both sides of the card. So you can have the team sitting on the opposite side and the clue givers sitting on one side, and then everyone can still read all of the words. In pictures, you can't do that, right?
Mm,
Because of the orientation of the card. So you may have to have your clue givers stand up and move over on the board to kind of look at the picture orientation setup if you have it directed toward the clue giver or the guessing team, or the opposite, where the guessing team will have to get up and look over and kind of see how it's oriented, unless you set it up in this awkward where it's kind of sideways for both team or for both
mm,
clue givers and stuff. So that's one of the very small cons, I would say, in terms of the like directional
mm,
aspect of the game setup and how you play the game. It's usually a party setting. It's usually not that big a deal, but that is something that could happen. The
mm,
other con I would say for Codenames, which to be fair is actually a con I have about party games in general, but in Codenames is you can have a lot of time in which, as we mentioned before with the sand timer, where there's a lot of downtime of people discussing or deliberating or thinking, which can make the game feel longer than it actually takes. Like, so from a time perspective, it really doesn't take that much more time, but the feeling of having to wait for somebody else, right? Because in terms of if it's not your turn to guess, you literally have to sit around and wait until it's the next turn. You may have a clue to mull over, but you can't do anything about it until right your team has a clue to give. So there's kind of a bit of downtime in between turns that, depending on how thinky people are, could make the game feel a lot longer than it really is when you're playing.
Okay, yeah. I mean, that's actually my biggest con too. The time and the feeling of it, where you can end up spending quite a bit of time like either waiting because it's not your team's turn, or when it's on your team's turn, waiting for your clue giver to actually come up with a clue.
Yeah.
And so yeah, so I think it's just that kind of waiting around, which would lead me to actually even, I mean, not to spoil my rating for this game, but would lead me to even recommend something like another game we have reviewed on this channel called Similo, which I remember when I was teaching Similo, I ended up realizing like I could easily explain it to people like John or people I played board games a lot with. I could say like, oh, it's literally half of Codenames, right? Because Codenames is you give the word and you have your team guess, and then the next team you give the clue giver gives a word and their team guesses. Where then Similo is really just the cooperative version of this game. So you're only playing just one team. You have the one clue giver who's always giving the clues, and you always need your teammates to guess correctly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so in that case, Similo being half of the game doesn't have that downtime of waiting for another team. And so yeah, so Similo is faster in that way, but if you do want a team versus team version of it,
Yes. Yeah.
then this would be the way to go about it, right? This would be a competitive version of that same kind of gameplay.
Exactly.
And so yeah, but still the time is my biggest con for the game. And I think the other small con I had just mentioned coming into this, talking about why I prefer the picture version slightly more, is because of needing to read all the words. And for people who might not understand what certain words mean, that could be a hindrance in some way. Not as obviously not that big a deal, because they can still guess it, or you could still try to hint at it in a certain way, or they'll have other teammates who can even explain what words mean if they want to ask about it. But just a possible small hindrance because of that. And I think the last con I would have is, at least again, comparing, I think, the word version to the picture version. In the setup, I had mentioned that the word version is a 5x5 grid, where the picture one is a 4x5. And so having fewer words obviously would make, or fewer pictures to guess would make the game probably run faster. And that's maybe why they made it smaller in the pictures version that came a year after the original. But again, I think that's not that big a deal because you kind of know how much time you're going to put into playing it. It just more comes down to whether you are more of a words person and associating just words you read, or if you're more of a visual person who can more easily spot things in the pictures you're seeing.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think those are our cons.
Well, I was going to say one other
Okay.
very small con as well. Again, this is dependent more on people you or I would say sometimes, like any party game, I think is sometimes the people who you play with will help make or break your game. I do think that this game can have some issues with people who make their opinions too loud or too strong when you play the game, because in this game, the guessing team should be coming up in a consensus in deciding or deliberating and choosing your words. Sometimes people who are more dominating in terms of like being outspoken or making their opinions known can potentially ruin the feeling or the experience. I don't think it happens too often, just something to be aware of. It's something, hopefully, maybe something that can help break the ice in that sense, because maybe if they choose wrong and they choose the assassin, then you can be like, yo, this is what you get for being, too aggressive or whatever, right? Like to help kind of bridge that a little bit, but it can happen. Or people, as we were saying, right? Like if you're not really a words person, it might be hard for you to get into the game. So hopefully if you have the pictures version, then you could use that one instead. But there is kind of a little bit of that sense. But I feel like that's the same with any party game, is it will ultimately depend on how many times you play the game. But it'll depend on, how invested people end up getting into the game can help make or break it, the experience as well, because it really is dependent on how people are interacting with each other, where you get the most fun out of this game. Otherwise, it's just like a guessing game of like, oh yeah, this word, this word, this word, that's not the fun of this game. The fun is in how people respond to each other, or how they, poke at each other about clues that they gave, and how you interact. So remember that this is a party game, it's a social game, and that is ultimately what you're trying to do. You're not really trying to play this like, you can play this competitively because it is a competitive game, but the real fun is in the social aspects of this game, as we were talking about, like the jokes about ways people give clues, or like the experience that comes out of the game. And kind of the game is more the medium to enhance that social experience. So
Oh yeah, so that actually, I did remember two other cons. One small, one very small. One small is actually, again, depending on the people you're playing with. Some people might not prefer the clue giver role
yeah.
because of them needing to not show any reaction to how their team is discussing their clue and what they're gonna guess.
Or having to think of clues.
Or that, yeah, some people want to avoid it because of that too. And so, but yeah, at least focusing on the idea of like not reacting, like I think that can also kind of require discipline from people that they don't want to be disciplined about, which I mean, it's up to you, honestly, if you care, if people are kind of like hinting on accident or stuff, depending on your friends, or how strict you are about you just can't show any facial expression, so that's something to be aware of that could turn people off from at least playing that role. And then the really small thing, and this comes from me as a person who teaches a lot of games to people, the one rule that I find always kind of weird to explain, not that long to, but still something additional that's weird and clumsy, is the whole idea of, if the clue giver says, what did I say? Well, let's just go with like flower 3, and then the team is guessing one word at a time, and they get one right, another right, another right. So if they got all 3 correct, then they get to guess one more, right? Like that rule, I always think is a little like strange to teach people, because it's not like each time you keep getting one right, you get to get another one. You only get to have that +1 guess, but that's also only after you've guessed like that same number correctly already, then you get that extra guess. So it's just a little clumsy, I think, to teach. And I get why gameplay wise it can add a little bit of excitement of like, we guess 3 and we actually just need one more correct to win.
Gamble.
So yeah, we'll just push our luck and go for maybe what we think it should be at this point based on previous clues, right? Like that's a little bit of excitement that's being added with that rule. And it makes sense that it's not also a rule where each time you get something correct, you could just keep going, because that can make one team steamroll the other one technically, right? But I just always think it's, in teaching that rule, it's, you just always have to kind of provide those clarifications, which then makes it a little clumsy of like, yeah, but only after you've guessed all the correct number correctly, then you get +1, but you also don't get more than that +1. And it's like, I don't know if it was needed, that rule, personally. But I don't know, John, you might disagree that
I
maybe that
mean,
excitement
I
is
think the
worth
rule
it.
is important because it is a way to get back into the game, right? So like, as we were saying, right, like sometimes when you're guessing, your team might guess wrong right away at the beginning, and then the enemy team has already gotten like 4 clues, right? So there does need to be a way in which you can get back into the game. So the allowance of the +1 rule is a good one. I think the way that we've usually described it and explained it is you have up to that many guesses, in terms of like you have the number +1 guesses in the turn. And so as long as you are correct in those guesses, you just go up to that number. And then of course, with the other rules being, if you don't guess one that's yours, then your turn is basically over, right? So that you use that as the overriding rule. And then it's just, you can guess the number +1 number worth of guesses for that turn, right? Like that's the way that I felt like has been easier, because I've also run into that issue when we've explained the game to new players. And that seems to be the simplest way, because then you can just say, and if you get it one wrong, then your just turn ends, period. And then the number doesn't matter anymore at that point, right? I think where it becomes really weird is when people are trying to wrap their mind around the association of the number to the clue.
Mm.
Sometimes like when they're trying to think of old clues, because that's part of the game, is you think of like previous clues and you're trying to be like, did we guess all of those words from the original clue that the player gave us? Then that so that can sometimes confuse people of like, oh yeah, we still have an extra guess, where it's like, no, that number only pertains to the clue at that point when it's a previous turn. It doesn't mean you get more guesses because you had an extra like 2 clues that you forgot last round, like the last 2 rounds. That's where it gets that's where I've seen it get confusing for some players, when they're trying to like retroactively keep guesses that they had in the past, right? It's like it doesn't stack, right? So yeah, but I do agree. I mean, that whole concept does. That's where it becomes more gamery. So people who are familiar with games, it's not too big to keep track of. But people who rarely or never play board games, that does get a little confusing. So yeah.
So those are our cons for the game, and now moving on to John guesses the weight. Wait, 3.
Wait.
Wait. So John will try to guess the weight of the base code names.
Yeah.
And if he gets it right, he will win a copy of the game from me. And he will also provide us with his rating for the game. And so, John, do you want to provide us with your weight first?
Yeah, so I'm guessing 1.24 for the weight. I think it's a pretty simple, straightforward game. And it's a party game. It better not be too high. Maybe it's like a 1.5, but I'm going with 1.24. Anyway, and then in terms of rating, I actually have 2 ratings. So I think my official rating for the game is a 7.5. My personal rating, I think, is a 7, and that's more because of my desire to play the game. In that sense, I think ultimately the game is a 7.5 because it is a very solid party game. It kind of, to me, reinvigorated the party game scene for board games by introducing something. Because I would say the game before Codenames that was probably the biggest splash was Apples to Apples. Before it, there are problems with Apples to Apples. I don't know if we're ever going to do a review of it. I personally think that Apples to Apples is problematic because it's really dependent on the players and how people interact and react. And it's really based on people, like just the way that they judge each other and the way that they interact with how words are being selected. It's kind of like Cards Against Humanity a little bit. I guess that's the other big one that was, I think that was technically before Codenames, if I remember correctly. Cards Against Humanity.
I believe so. Yeah.
So like those were like the big simple party games that people were always talking about, and I didn't have much of a flavor for those, especially after like you play it for like the 50 billionth time in like a night, and it's like tiring. But that being said, I do think it's a very solid game, as we mentioned before. It's very easy for people to ultimately jump into. You can have a large group of people. While it technically says up to 8 players, you can have as many people as you want on the guessing team. There is actually no limit. I think they set that limit just because having to discuss it with a bazillion people might take a while, but you could play with a lot of people. I think the most I played with is 14 people. Like I had a 7-on-7 game. Which, so you have 1 clue giver and then 6 guessers per team, which worked out fine, right? Because everyone just discussed it and then you kind of just decide. And then it allows time for small talk. Some people may be more invested at one point in the game and then kind of drift off a little bit, and then they can have conversations, but they're still part of the game, right? Where you can kind of have that feeling of like a real party atmosphere in that way, or like a large party atmosphere in that way. But then me, I give it a 7 because I played this game a lot. There is a certain point where party games, I don't enjoy playing party games a long time or for large periods of time. So I would rather play more crunchy or more like gamer games at that point. But I do understand the value of this game and its importance in the party sphere. So it is a 7. So if other people are willing to play the game and wanting to play, I'm not going to be like, I don't want to play the game at all. Like, I'll play it. It's just not going to be something that, for me, I would just be like, every time, let's play this game. I would look for maybe some other options. So
Okay. And so, and yeah, I remembered your weight, 1.29, and we'll show that in a little bit.
1.24, not 1.29.
1.244. Sorry.
Yes.
So 1.24. And so before I show if John gets the weight correctly, I will also explain my rating. I gave Codenames and Codename Pictures a 6.
Oh.
And I told
Wow,
John,
you went low.
I told John before this that I had adjusted my rating. I think for my rating from a while back, a long time ago when I first played these, I gave both of them 6.5, which while you were talking, I was like, should I bump it back up to 6.5? I think I ultimately settled on 6 still because 6, at least according to the BGG scale, that's I think the description is will play if in the mood. Where 7 is usually willing to play, where then I don't feel like it's ultimately even between, like, you know, sometimes I'm usually willing to play. I think it's always gonna be if I'm in the mood for a party game nowadays, especially considering a few of the other games I've rated, maybe even other like games for fewer player count, but maybe some more mechanics, but also still lighter games. Like those, I think I've given like 6.5 or 7. And so those are games I do admittedly think I would want to play those first before going to Codenames as a party game. And that might just because my own taste is I would usually almost always prefer like a slightly more mechanical 4-player game versus choosing a party game for a lot of people. Like I think John even knows, like when I've had game nights with a lot of people, versus playing something like Codenames, I would more often want to even just split into 2 groups playing 2 separate games or fewer player counts. And so again, that's not a big knock on the game. Like it's 6 sounds bad, but it's, you know, it's still we'll play if in the mood. And it's just because, I'm rarely in the mood for party games. But I think also the reason why it's low, the biggest knock against it is, again, that con of the time of kind of waiting around, where it's not like other games where like you might have time to wait, but then you're thinking about what to do next, especially in heavy strategy games, right? Where it's someone else's turn, but you're still trying to plan ahead on what you're doing on your turn. Like in this one, it can often be times of like, you're literally just sitting waiting for the other team, like you don't even have anything to think through about your own turn, so you are just waiting. And so I think that kind of hurts it the most, and in that way, that's why, like I mentioned, I would even prefer Similo over this, which I did rate higher than a 6, so I had to at least put this below whatever rating I gave Similo, which I believe was a 7. So I give Codenames and Codename Pictures both a 6. Again, I've only kept the pictures version because of what I mentioned previously about kind of being language independent, but I think that's only like a very small kind of plus to it. It's still essentially the same game anyway, so both get the same rating of 6 from me. And so with that, we'll go on to seeing the weights. 1.24, you guessed. So let me share the BGG page.
If I get it, I'm saving the money so I can get a different game.
Well, maybe you should have listened to how I accidentally hinted at 1.29.
Nah, it's fine.
It totally slipped because I was just looking at the page.
Yeah, it's fine. I had a guess you probably did that, but it's fine. That's why I was like, no,
You were so close though, 0.05. That's your closest in recent memory.
I know, because I was in the 100th spaces this time, not just the 10th.
And then as you guys can see on BGG, right, it is really well rated by the general public, right? 7.6. Really solid, and number 2 party game of all time.
Hey, what's number 1 now?
Oh yeah, what is number 1? Let's look.
Because Codenames was number 1 for the
longest time. It was number 1 for a long time.
It had been number 1 for the past, like, basically 2016.
Oh no. Decrypto, interesting. I have heard of that one.
Yeah, maybe we'll have to look into that one. Hmm.
Okay. But yes, Codenames was number one for a long time from what I remember when it came
Yep.
out.
Yep.
And then even Codenames Pictures, I believe, let me see, I believe it's also on the party games list pretty high up there, like number 18 or something I just saw before doing this video. Yeah, number 18 of all time. So even this other version of the same game is way up there on the party games list.
Yep.
And so yeah, and then I guess the last thing to let you guys know, yeah, there are those other themed versions that you, if you're interested, you can look into. And then also the 2-player version, Codenames Duet, which I heard was pretty good. And then also you guys can even try the game. I mean, I always love board games because of them being in person, right? And playing with these physical, tangible components, moving them around. But of course, during these times, it can be hard to do that. And so there is an official website to play Codenames online. I guess it's just codenames.game, huh?
Yep.
And so, yeah, I believe this is the official version by the publisher in a bunch of different languages too, apparently. And so, yeah, you can just play this online with your friends through this browser on this website. So that's a great way for you guys to try it out or play it with friends that you can't play in person with currently. And so just wanted to let you guys know that that's available. And so with that, that is our review of Codenames and somewhat Codename Pictures.
Kodonames.
Codenames. I was going to say that in the very beginning too.
I should have showed a picture of edamame.
That's our secret way of talking about the Codenames.
But yes.
And so with that, I hope you found this interesting, helpful. If you found the game interesting, definitely check it out. Easy to get to try online, easy to find in stores nowadays. And hopefully you'll consider subscribing to this channel. Share this video with people you play board games with, friends, family, and even follow us on Instagram at I Got Board Game. And until next time, we'll see you then. Bye.
Bye.